interesting question that comes up a lot is, should I use Kubernetes in the cloud? So like, a managed Kubernetes service offering or Kubernetes as a service, whatever you like to call it, or an on-prem Kubernetes cluster. And what that means is, you're managing the infrastructure, you're managing the VMs, you're managing the underlying OS, all that stuff. And I would say, yeah, using a cloud service, like AKS or EKS is easier in certain aspects, but of course, there are many circumstances where you would want something on-prem. So for example, if you want a little bit more control over CNIs, if you want a little bit more control over OIDC, if you want a little bit more control over how etcd is working, how the API server, how the control plane is working, how you're scaling it out, how it's secured. But to be honest, in a lot of cases, I would say, 70 to 80% of the cases that I've seen, you don't need all of that control. Well, not that you don't need it, but you don't have a specific use case for it. And because of that, a lot of people tend to go with a managed Kubernetes service offering. So let's go ahead and talk about the overall complications of self-hosted Kubernetes. Now, have you ever seen the project Kubernetes the Hard Way by Kelsey Hightower? If you haven't, you should definitely check it out. Even if you don't want to go through it, you can still just look at it from a theoretical perspective. And this particular project goes through bootstrapping everything. I'm talking etcd, talking the entire control plane, even down to the CA, the certificate authority, to get everything working inside of Kubernetes from a cert authentication perspective. In a managed Kubernetes service offering, you don't have to go through all of that. Even if you look at a bootstrapper like kubeadm, you don't have to go through all that. Once you kind of configure it and go through it, everything is done for you automatically. So like when you run kubeadm init, it does the API server, it does the etcd server, it does all of it. But like in today's world, you're not really going to see a lot of that. You're going to see a lot of AKS, GKE, EKS, and that ultimately means the control plane is abstracted away from you. So having to manage etcd, having to manage a scheduler, the controller manager, it's all abstracted away from you. Really, all you have to worry about is the worker nodes. So when we're thinking about, Kubernetes on-prem versus a managed offering, let's break it down into 5 key pieces: cost, complexity, auto-scaling, third-party solutions, and hybrid deployments. Now, from a cost perspective, it's going to come down to a few different things. Number one, in the cloud, you have the subscription model, or you're reserving instances, whatever the case may be. You're paying for a service. You're paying a monthly fee for a service. On-prem, you're paying for the data center, you're paying for the hardware, you're paying for, whatever servers you're buying, the operating system licenses, all of that. Now, in both scenarios, you do need to have engineers that are well equipped and prepared for each environment. Now, on-prem, you're going to need engineers that, understand data centers. In the cloud, you don't necessarily need those same engineers, but you do need the engineers that are sysadmins, that are network administrators, or storage administrators, because all of that stuff still exists in the cloud, just like it does on-prem. The only difference is it's software defined versus actually manually touching and configuring the hardware. So regardless of where you're running it, you're still going to run into specific costs when it comes to engineers, but the cost in terms of how you're running it is going to be a little bit different. The next is complexity, and I'm going to be talking about that a little bit more in depth, but I do just want to bring it up. The biggest piece is engineers needing to know the underlying Kubernetes pieces versus not having to know them as in depth. And from a complexity perspective, and having to essentially study the internals of Kubernetes for years, you don't have to go through all that. Portainer can obviously manage all of that from start to finish. Now, from an auto-scaling perspective, let's think about it. When we're in the cloud, you kind of have like unlimited resources, right? And as long as you're paying for them, you have unlimited resources. So let's say you need to auto-scale. You click the auto scale button and boom, you got new servers coming up. But on-prem, it's not like that because you need to have VMs ready to go if it scales. So if you got 2 worker nodes running and you need 3, 4, 5 because the load from a pod perspective, yeah, like those 2 to 3 VMs are going to have to be essentially sitting there waiting to be spun up, which is fine. You can automate all that. It's no big deal, but you need to have that hardware sitting there. That hardware needs to be available. Whereas in the cloud, it's a little bit easier to literally click a button and scales when it needs to scale up, scales down when it needs to scale down. And that goes for, the worker nodes and the pods from a horizontal scaling perspective. Now, third-party solutions, yeah, it's kind of hard to beat what the cloud gives you. So like if you're in Azure, for example, you don't really have to worry about like how we're going to manage RBAC, how we're going to manage authentication, because you got Azure Active Directory there. In AWS, you got AWS IAM. And then a lot of times with these services, like if you look at AKS, there's like, you know, a built-in GitOps service. There's built-in monitoring. Like all these things are kind of there for you out of the box, which is awesome. And then the last piece here is from a hybrid perspective. So here's the thing. In like 2014, 2015, there was a lot of talk around, you know, data centers are going to go away. Everything's going to move to the cloud. Yeah, it didn't happen. There's a lot of engineers still running workloads on-prem. And because of that, Azure, AWS, GCP, they're all kind of seeing this and they're building different solutions. So Azure has Azure Stack HCI to manage AKS on-prem. AWS has EKS Anywhere that does the same thing. Google has Anthos that does the same thing. Organizations are seeing this. So if you are in a scenario where you need to run things on-prem, you need to run Kubernetes clusters on-prem, it's perfectly fine. You can. All right, so actually one more thing here, and then we're going to move on to the overall knowledge required. Managed Kubernetes services kind of give you stuff out of the box that an on-prem Kubernetes cluster won't. So for example, load balancers. Load balancers are a huge thing here. On-prem, yeah, you can use load balancers. So you can have a Kubernetes service, you can have it of type load balancer, and you can deploy a load balancer. Problem is that you need to have something like MetalLB, which is like a virtual load balancer tool or platform, whatever you'd like to call it, to create load balancers. And that's another piece of the puzzle that you need to manage. Whereas, you know, with AKS, with EKS, with GKE, when you use the type load balancer in your Kubernetes service, it just automatically deploys a load balancer in the cloud for you. Same thing with autoscaling, right? We just talked about it. You click a button, boom, you have new worker nodes. So yeah, being in the cloud from a managed Kubernetes service perspective, it does make things a little bit easier a lot of the times. All right, so now let's talk about the overall knowledge required here. To actually understand everything that's needed, I would say that there's like, you would have to go through 10 to 15 books, start to finish, or maybe more, just to have an understanding. From an on-prem perspective, you need to dive into virtualization. You need to dive into networking on-prem. You need to dive into firewalls, routers, switches, storage, all of it. And you also need to understand the underlying Kubernetes components, etcd, the scheduler, the controller manager, all of that. You need to understand everything, the Q proxy, you need to understand CNIs, you need to understand all of it. Now, funny enough, I actually posted about this pretty recently, like talking about the prerequisites to, you know, get into Kubernetes, especially from an on-prem perspective. I went over the operating system, infrastructure, networking, storage, CI/CD, general programming, and a lot of different things. And I think a lot of people agreed with it because the post ended up getting over 1,600 likes, 35 comments, 68 reposts, and over 100,000 impressions. So it was seen a lot. A lot of people agreed with it. And the reason why is because it's true. There are a lot of things you need to know from an on-prem perspective. Like you need a team. You need people that are operating system folks. You need people that are infrastructure folks, networking, etc. Now, that's just the one piece. And then the other piece is understanding Kubernetes as a whole. So like if you're running Kubernetes clusters on-prem, you need to understand 100% of Kubernetes. Now, if you're running it in the cloud, because the control plane is abstracted away from you, so etcd, the API server, etc., that's all abstracted away from you, you should still know it, but you got to maybe know 50% of it. Versus on-prem, you got to know 100% of it inside and out. Now, we kind of talked about this a little bit, but you do need an entire team to run an on-prem Kubernetes cluster. Now, plug alert, Portainer does manage a lot of that for you. So everything that you would have to essentially do on-prem, Portainer abstracts that away from you, whether you're running on-prem or in the cloud. But if you're running on-prem just standalone, yeah, you got to have the operating system person, you got to have the infrastructure person, the network person, the storage person, the security person, all that. You need an entire team. Whereas running a managed Kubernetes service offering, again, a lot of the control plane, well, not a lot, literally all of the control plane, the scaling, the management, it's all abstracted away from you. You don't even touch it. You don't even see it. The best that you can do is get logs from it. Now, what's a good middle ground here between maybe on-prem and a managed Kubernetes service? I like Micro K8s. It's literally spelled just micro and then K8s. It's from Conical. And they kind of specify it as like a zero ops Kubernetes solution. And what's really cool about it is, you know, you could run it on your laptop, you can run it on-prem, it is production ready, it is enterprise ready. And I do like that it has these add-ons. So like as you're installing it, you can install things like Istio, Cilium, Grafana as an add-on. So like you don't have to manage that kind of manually. It's kind of automated for you in terms of the installation. Now, the final thing that we'll talk about here is good old-fashioned security. So here's the thing. If you're running Kubernetes on-prem or if you're running Kubernetes in the cloud, you're going to have the same security problems. Lack of awareness around namespaces, policy enforcement agents or policy managements like Open Policy Agent or Kyverno, something like that. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Kyverno, Kyverno. Check it out if you haven't already. It's pretty cool. And then general RBAC, which is a management nightmare for every engineer that has ever used it. It's definitely a nightmare. So, namespaces, you can segregate containers, you can segregate service accounts that can spin up those containers, you can segregate people who can access those containers, but things like, pod-to-pod communication, service-to-service communication, it can happen even if, containerized apps are in different namespaces, doesn't matter. So because of that, you would typically set up something like a service mesh to encrypt that traffic. You would set up network policies to ensure that this namespace can only talk to this namespace. A couple of the CNIs have the ability to do that as well. So Cilium, Calico, you can set up those policies. And then there's the RBAC piece. So RBAC is just authorization, so just permissions. Out of the box, Kubernetes doesn't have anything from a user management perspective, so you have to use a third-party solution. Now, I'm going to say this with caution, please don't do it. I need a red caution tape here. You can manage Linux users for Kubernetes, and you can associate a cert to those Linux users. Don't do it. It's a nightmare. Literally nobody does it in production. Imagine having to manage 50 users like that, 50 certificates, and then giving all the permissions. No, don't do it. The only reason I bring it up is because, it is possible. Do just want to mention it, but yeah. Now, everything that we talked about from a security perspective, our pod security policies, RBAC, user management, role management, OPA, so, any type of policy enforcement, that is all baked into Portainer as well. So whether you're running on-prem or you're running in the cloud, it doesn't matter. Portainer can manage all of these security features. So with that, I hope that this helped you kind of choose whether you want to use on-prem or, a managed Kubernetes service. I hope it kind of helped you as well figure out the nuances and the struggles of hosting Kubernetes yourself. Thank you so much for watching. Really appreciate it, and we'll see you again next time.